Oregon is famous for its fir forests that touch the clouds, for its snow-capped mountains that dominate the horizon, and for a coastline so wild, it feels like the edge of the world. Tourists come for the parks and the rivers and the natural beauty the state offers with a generosity that few parts of America can match. But away from those familiar routes, hidden in mountain valleys and high-elevation plains and sandbars the ocean devoured, there are towns that people once called home and then abandoned. Places that do not appear on modern maps. Places where the past refuses to leave, where buildings still stand, and the echoes of what was still float in the cold mountain air. In this video, we are going to explore 13 of those towns. Each one disappeared for its own reason. The sea that consumed the land. It's the railroad that chose another route. The war that shut the mines overnight. A religious movement that took control of a town and then collapsed. The fire that consumed in hours what had taken decades to build. These are the 13 Oregon ghost towns that refuse to be forgotten. Let's begin. Number 13. Bay Ocean. Bay Ocean was founded in 1906 with an ambition that few projects of its era could match. Its promoters called it the Atlantic City of the West, and it was not an empty boast. The plan included a world-class hotel, an enormous heated saltwater swimming pool, a ballroom, and the full range of amenities that in the early 20th century defined luxury at a vacation destination. The location was a sandbar more than 4 miles long that separated Tillamook Bay from the open ocean. And during the 1910s, thousands of tourists arrived by ferry to enjoy the beaches and the escape from mainland life. What made Bay Ocean beautiful also made it impossibly fragile. In 1917, the construction of a jetty at the bay's mouth unintentionally altered the natural currents and tidal flow. That change set off an erosion cycle that began eating the sand beneath the town's foundations, slowly at first, then with a speed that left no time to react. In 1932, winter storms destroyed the swimming pool and several houses. In the years that followed, the sea kept advancing. Entire streets disappeared. Whole blocks of buildings were swallowed by the ocean. In 1952, a breach in the sandbar sealed the fate of the last residents. The last house fell into the water in 1960. Bay Ocean ceased to exist as an inhabited place and became a memory. Today, the site is a nature preserve where almost no visible trace remains of the grand resort it once was. Beneath the tides rest the foundations of a dream the ocean decided to reclaim. Bay Ocean is the most brutal reminder on this list that there are forces against which human ambition simply has no answer. Number 12. Antelope. Antelope was established in 1871 as a quiet stagecoach stop on the road between the Dalles and Canyon City. For decades, it was exactly what it appeared to be. A small settlement for ranchers and travelers, officially incorporated in 1901, living at a slow and predictable pace in the hills of Wasco County. Modern roads began to bypass it, and the town settled into the kind of quiet forgetting that comes to places the world stops needing. And then, in 1981, the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh arrived. The movement had purchased the Big Muddy Ranch, a vast property nearby, and began building a communal city there that at its peak would reach tens of thousands of residents. But Antelope was the nearest incorporated municipality, and that made it a target. In 1984, the movement's followers took control of the local government through electoral processes and changed the town's official name to Rajneesh. What followed was one of the strangest episodes in the modern history of any American town. Television cameras arrived from around the world. Journalists covered every development. Tensions between the new residents and the longtime inhabitants of the area were constant and sometimes violent. The town that had spent decades in obscurity was suddenly on the front pages of international newspapers. The movement collapsed in 1985 after legal scandals and internal conflicts that ended with the flight and eventual arrest of Bhagwan himself. In 1986, the remaining residents voted to restore the original name. Antelope became Antelope again. And then, it returned to silence, with the same naturalness with which it had fallen into it before everything started. Today it is once again a near-empty town in the hills of Wasco County. Only now it has a story that no other small town in Oregon can claim. Number 11. Cornucopia. Cornucopia is nestled deep in the Wallowa Mountains in Baker County, in a place so remote that its very existence as a town is hard to believe. It was established in 1885 after prospectors discovered rich gold-bearing quartz veins in the cliffs above the valley. And what was built there was a community that defied isolation with a stubbornness that can only come from those who know that beneath their feet there is enough wealth to justify any hardship. At its peak, the Cornucopia mines produced more than $15 million in gold, a figure that in today's terms would represent hundreds of millions. That money attracted thousands of miners and their families, who built a complete town at an elevation where snow could pile 6 feet deep in the streets and where access to the outside world was cut off for months each winter. It was not a place for those who valued comfort. It was a place for those who valued gold more than comfort. The end of Cornucopia did not come from mineral exhaustion or gradual decline. It came all at once in 1941, when the federal government issued War Production Board Order L208, which forced the closure of all non-essential gold mines to redirect labor toward the war effort. The town was abandoned practically overnight. Tools were left where they were. Houses were left with their belongings inside. Cornucopia went from a living town to an empty one in the time it takes a government order to take effect. It never recovered. Today, some modern cabins coexist alongside deteriorating mining structures and wooden houses tilting toward the earth. The heavy silence of the mountains dominates streets that once rang with the noise of stamp mills. Cornucopia is the town the war extinguished with a single breath. Number 10. Bridal Veil. Bridal Veil is located in the spectacular Columbia River Gorge, one of the most dramatic landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. The town began its life in 1886 as a company lumber settlement built around an active sawmill where workers and their families lived in immediate proximity to the industry that sustained them. The basalt cliffs and waterfalls cascading from above formed the permanent backdrop for a community that existed to cut and process timber from the dense forests covering the slopes. At its peak, the Bridal Veil Lumbering Company was one of the most productive timber operations in the entire region. The houses, stores, and services of the town revolved around the daily rhythm of the sawmill, which marked time with the regularity of something that seems to have always existed and will continue to exist forever. The sawmill closed in 1960. The population left with it. The town site was cleared over the years, and the last remains of the mill were demolished in 2001 to restore the land to its natural state. Today, only a few scattered foundations and a historic cemetery remain. Almost nothing, except the post office. Established in 1887, the Bridal Veil Post Office still operates today as one of the smallest postal stations in the United States. And around its name, something unexpected happened. Couples from around the world send their wedding invitations specifically to this address, so they will carry the Bridal Veil postmark. A town that disappeared as a living community is still sending love to the world through its stamps. It is perhaps the strangest and most beautiful way to survive abandonment that exists. Number 9. Whitney. Whitney was established in 1901 as a vital support point for the Sumter Valley Railroad and for the region's timber industry. The railroad passed directly through the town, and that fact was everything. The trains brought workers, carried lumber, and connected Whitney to markets and to the outside world in a way that made the existence of a community in that remote corner of Baker County possible. Families settled near the tracks and built their houses and businesses with the confidence of those who know the train will keep coming tomorrow and the day after. The sound of steam whistles and the rhythm of loading and unloading lumber marked the passage of each day. At its peak, Whitney had hundreds of residents and was an important shipping point for the region. In 1918, a devastating fire destroyed much of the town. Whitney tried to recover, but the blow had been too deep. The timber industry declined in the following decades, and in 1947, the railroad closed permanently. Without the trains, Whitney's reason for existing disappeared. Families left. Buildings stood empty. Today, only a few aged houses and stone foundations of buildings that no longer exist remain scattered across the open meadows where the town once stood. Nature has reclaimed much of the site. The quiet fields speak of the passage of time and the disappearance of the industry that built them. Whitney is what remains when the train stops coming. Number 8. Greenhorn. Greenhorn holds the unenviable distinction of being the highest incorporated city in Oregon at 6,270 feet above sea level in the Blue Mountains, on the border between Baker and Grant counties. It was established in 1895 following the discovery of rich gold-bearing quartz veins in the surrounding peaks, and the community that grew there did so with full awareness that living at that altitude was a choice gold made possible, but that nature would never make easy. Winters in Greenhorn were brutal. Snow covered the streets for months and cut off access to the outside world for weeks at a time. Summers were short and the work was hard, but the gold was there. And as long as the gold was there, so were the people. Between 1900 and 1910, Greenhorn had hotels, stores, and even its own newspaper. It was a real town that functioned with the stubbornness of those who have decided that cold and isolation are acceptable prices for what the mountain offers. The post office closed in 1919. The population began descending to the valleys where life was less demanding. By the time World War II began in 1941, the mines were closed and Greenhorn had been surrendered to the elements. Today, the town has no permanent residents. The wooden buildings still standing are silent against the mountain backdrop. The roads become nearly impassable in winter, making Greenhorn completely inaccessible for much of the year. It is a place that exists at the margins of the habitable world, exactly as it always was. Number 7. Hardman. Hardman was established in 1879 and began its life under the unconventional name Yellow Dog, a nickname that reflected the roughness of its beginnings as a pioneer and ranching settlement in Morrow County. Over time, the name changed, and the town grew into an important social center for the wheat farmers of the surrounding region, a place where neighbors came to exchange goods, share news, and remind each other that they were not alone on those open plains. The heart of Hardman was the Odd Fellows Hall, built in 1900. That building hosted meetings, dances, and celebrations that were the social fabric of the town. At its best, Hardman had 2 hotels, several general stores, and an active school. The main street was full of activity when farmers arrived after the harvest, and neighbors gathered to talk about wheat prices and the weather coming in. The decline began when the railroad chose another route, and automobiles made it easier to travel to larger cities. Without the need to stop in Hardman, people stopped stopping in Hardman. The post office closed in 1968, which is the date historians use as the moment Hardman officially ceased to be a functioning town. Today, the main street is largely empty. The historic storefront facades crumble slowly under the sun. They are the aged outlines of a community that existed because people needed each other, and that disappeared when the world changed. And that need found other ways to be met. Number 6. Granite. Granite was settled in 1862 by the first miners to reach these remote mountains of Grant County. They called it Independence at its founding, with the kind of optimism that characterized early settlements of the American West. But the name was taken by another Oregon town, and when the post office was finally established in 1878, the town had to adopt the name Granite, which described the type of rock that dominated the landscape at nearly 4,600 feet of elevation. The real activity came in the 1890s, when several large mines began operating in the surrounding mountains, and the influx of miners and their money transformed Granite into a community of some energy. It was a hard place. The terrain was steep, the climate severe, and isolation was the natural state of things. But a resilient community flourished anyway. built on the shared understanding that surviving here required depending on your neighbor in a way that city life never demanded. Today, Granite has a minimal permanent population. Several 19th century buildings still stand, including some houses and public structures that offer a direct window into the town's early days. Walking through Granite feels like stepping back to a time when survival depended on personal toughness and neighbors were everything. The town outlasted almost everything, and what little remains is still there. Number 5. Bourne is located north of Sumter, along Cracker Creek in Baker County. The town was established in 1895 and quickly became an active center of the regional gold rush. Miners and their families arrived in sufficient numbers to build houses, stores, and a post office that was the town's most concrete connection to the outside world. The streets rang with the constant noise of heavy mining equipment, and the promise of wealth kept the activity at a level that made it seem the town would last. During the early years of the 20th century, Bourne was a significant gold producer, but the mines began to decline. And in 1927, the post office closed its doors. That closure was the most visible sign that Bourne had stopped being a place where people arrived and had started being a place where people left. Today, the town has almost completely disappeared into the surrounding forest. Old mining equipment lies scattered among the trees like accidental sculptures. The wooden structures that were once solid collapse under the accumulated weight of time, snow, and moisture. Moss and vines advance over everything that remains with the infinite patience of what knows it will win. Bourne is a place where nature is in the active process of erasing the traces of human ambition, and where you can still watch that process happening in real time. Number 4. Sumter. Sumter was originally settled in 1862 by 5 Confederate soldiers who discovered gold in the valley while the rest of the country was at war. That discovery triggered a boom that drew thousands of miners and entrepreneurs from across the region, and the town grew with the speed and disorder that characterize all places where gold and ambition meet. The community was built on the promise of wealth, and for a time, that promise held. In 1913, the Sumter Valley Dredge began operating, a floating machine of imposing dimensions that extracted gold from the riverbeds with an efficiency no individual miner could match. With its enormous steel buckets and heavy frame, the dredge became the most visible symbol of the town's industrial ambition. It operated for decades, yet leaving behind it the unmistakably altered landscape of dredge-worked valleys, gravel mounds arranged in rows like the footprints of a giant that did not watch where it stepped. In 1917, a devastating fire destroyed much of the commercial district. Sumter staggered but did not fall. And that resilience is what defines the town today more than any other aspect of its history. Unlike most of the ghosts on this list, Sumter still breathes. The Sumter Valley Railroad, historic area, operates its steam locomotives and carries tourists through the scenic valley, keeping the past alive. Visitors walk among the old buildings and see demonstrations of period mining equipment. Sumter is a living ghost town, where the stories of gold and labor are still being told by those who decided they were worth keeping alive. Number 3. Buncombe was founded in 1851 when Chinese miners arrived in the Little Applegate River Valley looking for gold and the possibility of a new life in Oregon. They settled at a quiet crossroads and built a compact mining camp where workers lived in close proximity, depending on one another in the way that life in an isolated place surrounded by unforgiving nature demands. Buncombe was never a large town and never tried to be. It was a functional, austere place built for work and not for display. After the first gold boom settled down, the town continued as a local center. The Buncombe Post Office opened in 1896 and for years was the settlement's most important link to the outside world. What makes Buncombe extraordinary today is not its history, but its state of preservation. It is one of the best preserved examples of a 19th century mining camp in all of Oregon. 3 main structures remain remarkably intact despite decades of exposure to the elements: the post office, the workers' bunkhouse, and the communal kitchen. Those three buildings are direct windows into the daily life of miners from more than 150 years ago, into their routines, their shared spaces, the kind of existence built when work is everything and rest is only the time between shifts. Buncombe is a quiet historical treasure in a corner of Oregon that very few people have reason to seek out. Number 2, Golden in Josephine County was established in 1890 as a mining town with one characteristic that set it absolutely apart from every other camp in the American West of its era. In Golden, there were no saloons and no gambling, no alcohol of any kind. That was not an accident or a circumstance. It was a deliberate decision by the town's founder, Reverend William Rubel, who established the community on the principles of faith and family life and used his authority to maintain those rules firmly. Most 19th century mining camps were known for their chaos and violence, for the barroom brawls and the gambling that ruined men in a single night. Golden was the opposite of all that. The church built in 1892 was the true center of town life, the place that set the rhythm of the weeks and gave the community its coherence. For a time, that combination of mining and orderly life worked. The Rubel family's hydraulic mining operations were productive, and the town had the stability that comes from a community sharing not just a place, but also values and expectations. But when the gold began to run low, people left. The post office closed in 1920. The town emptied. Today, Golden is an Oregon State Heritage Site. Several original buildings still stand: the church, the school, the general store. Walking through Golden feels like stepping directly into the past, into a town that chose to be different from all the others, and that time preserved with a care that seems fitting for a place that believed in the durability of its values. In 1903, it was the center of the wool world. In 1911, the railroad abandoned it. The clock stopped that day and never moved again. Number 1. Shaniko. In the early 20th century, Shaniko was not simply a town. It was an empire. By 1903, it had earned the title of Wool Capital of the World, a title that was not ceremonial, but completely literal. The Shaniko warehouse processed 5 million pounds of wool in a single year. The town sat on a high plateau in Wasco County and was the terminal point of the Columbia Southern Railroad, making it the mandatory gateway to the vast ranching lands of Central Oregon. Everything that entered and left that region passed through Shaniko. All the money generated by thousands of square miles of ranches passed through Shaniko. The people who lived there knew it, and they built a town worthy of that awareness. The Shaniko Hotel dominated the town's horizon. It was a brick and timber structure that offered travelers an unexpected level of comfort in such a remote place. Next to the hotel stood the jail, solid and well built. The school served the children of merchants and ranchers. The streets smelled of sage and cattle and locomotive steam, and the activity of commerce marked the rhythm of every day. Shaniko felt invincible. In 1911, the Oregon-Washington Railroad and Navigation Company completed a new line through the Deschutes River Canyon. The new route was more direct and more efficient than the service that ran through Shaniko. Commerce followed the new tracks with the indifference that money has for local feelings. Within a few years, the current of activity that had made Shaniko the center of its world simply shifted away and never came back. The town that had processed millions of pounds of wool fell silent. The merchants left. The ranchers found other routes. The streets that had rung with the noise of commerce and train whistles stood empty. Today, Shaniko is one of Oregon's most iconic ghost towns. About 30 residents still live there. The Hotel Shaniko still stands, preserved with a care that seems to honor the greatness it once had. Vintage automobiles are lined up on the dirt streets, as if someone parked them a century ago and nobody remembered to move them. The storefronts look exactly as they did in 1911. Shaniko is a place where the clock stopped the day the railroad abandoned it, and where no one, in all the years since, has had the heart to start it again. It is the most perfect monument in Oregon to a truth this list has illustrated again and again, that the fate of a town, with all its history and all its pride, can depend on a single line drawn on a map by someone who never lived there. Closing. 13 towns. 13 stories of what human beings build and destroy in the Oregon landscape. The ocean that devoured a city of sand. The war that shut the mines overnight. The railroad that decided to go another way and sentenced to death the towns that depended on it. The religious movement that took control of a town and then collapsed, leaving behind only silence. The fire that in hours destroyed what had taken decades to build. Oregon does not advertise its ghost towns with the same enthusiasm with which it advertises its national parks and its waterfalls. They are there, on the old maps and on the dirt roads that end where there is nothing left, waiting for those with the curiosity to look for them and the patience to listen to what they have to say. And what they have to say, if you stop long enough to hear it is that behind every ruined building and every grass-covered street, there were people who believed that what they were building would last, that their children would grow up here, and that their children would have children here, and that the town would still be standing long after they themselves were gone. Sometimes they were right. Most of the time, they were not.